So this morning we're concluding our conversation about stewardship by turning to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 26, and I've expanded the verses of this reading to go through from verse 1 through verse 15. And if you're following along with me in the Blue Pew Bibles, you'll find it in the Old Testament section on page 180. Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 through 15. Listen now for God's word to you. When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, which you harvest from the land the Lord your God is giving you. And you shall put it in a basket and go to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. You shall go to the priest who is in office at that time and say to him, "Today I declare to the Lord your God that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us." When the priest takes the basket from your hand and sets it down before the altar of the Lord your God, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. "A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as a foreigner, few in number. And there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. You shall set it down before the Lord your God and bow before the Lord your God. Then you, together with the Levites and the foreigners who reside among you, shall celebrate all the bounty that the Lord your God has given you into your house. When you have finished paying all the tithe of your produce in the third year, which is the year of the tithe, giving it to the Levites, the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows, so that they may eat their fill within your towns, then you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the sacred portion from the house, and I have given it to the Levites, the resident aliens, the orphans, and the widows, in accordance with your entire commandment that you have commanded me. I have neither transgressed nor forgotten any of your commandments. I have not eaten of it while in mourning, and I have not removed any of it while I was unclean. I have not offered any of it to the dead. I have obeyed the Lord my God, doing just as you commanded me. Look down from your holy habitation from heaven, and bless your people Israel and the ground that you have given us, as you swore to our ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey. This is the word of God for you, the people of God. Thanks be to God. So as I said, we are concluding our conversation about stewardship and the financial health of this congregation this morning. When I say concluding, I mean in the sense that I am going to stop the sermon series that I've been doing throughout the month of October. And certainly this is an ongoing conversation, one that will happen beyond the pulpit, from those who work hard managing the finances of this church. And certainly it's one that needs to happen more than just 1 month during the year. But for now, I'm going to stop talking about money after today. You may be relieved that I'm going to stop talking about money from the pulpit. And if that's you, I join you in that relief. I, like so many of my pastoral colleagues, really dislike talking about money. It might have been Jesus' favorite topic. It was the thing he talked about more than anything else. But those of us who serve as pastors in his church, by and large, really don't like talking about money. Over the last few weeks, we've talked about the financial health of this congregation, and last week we had our congregational meeting complete with a PowerPoint showing the church budget, showing how our expenses are exceeding our budget, and there were questions of sustainability and a plea for an increase in giving. The last month, I think, has been a difficult conversation for all of us. Even my preaching, I think, has been difficult. I feel like I've sort of been slogging through this conversation about money. There's been stress and anxiety about the church finances. And so when I was preparing for worship this week, I had planned on preaching from Acts, the passage that Michelle read just a few minutes ago. Now, don't get me wrong, that's a beautiful passage about the early church, how they joined together in response to the gospel of Jesus Christ. But when I was planning on what I was going to say, I felt like it was more of that stressful message about church finances. And to be honest, I've grown kind of tired of talking about money in that way. And so I took a second look at this Deuteronomy passage that was already in my worship plan for this week. And as I read through it, I found a hopeful and inspiring message about what giving to the community makes possible. And so I was given new life in reading this passage from Deuteronomy. Now, you might not expect to find a hopeful message from the book of Deuteronomy. It's one of the books of the Torah, the law, instructing us on how to live. We tend to think of the law as something burdensome, something that Jesus has superseded. But that's not the case. For those who wrote Deuteronomy and for its original audience, this was a book of life, showing the people of God how they were called to live. Yes, God chooses Israel out of deep love and faithfulness to them, but election is never only for people's benefit and blessing. It always has an ethical component to it. There has been this grand vision since God called Abraham back in Genesis that all nations will be blessed because of him. God calls the Hebrews to embody God's intentions for the world, to become the sort of community that when others look at them, they can see who God is. But that's a large vision, and it needs some particulars. The law is there to help people live into that vision, to have concrete ways of giving the example of who God is. Deuteronomy is one of those books. It's not a book of burdensome rules and regulations, but one that shows what it means to live as one of God's people. It's a book of life, not only for individuals, but for the whole community. It shows them how to live in response to God's unbreakable covenant with them. The book of Deuteronomy, in the words of one scholar, is the climax of the Exodus story. Israel has been wandering in the wilderness for 39 years, 11 months, and 1 week. And now they stand at the edge of the wilderness looking into their new home, the Promised Land. Moses, the great prophet who led the liberation movement from Egypt and who has been their leader in all of their wilderness wanderings, will not be going with them. God has told him as much. Soon a new leader, Joshua, will take over. But before that happens, before they enter the Promised Land, Moses has some final words for them. The authors and editors of Deuteronomy present the main body of the book as a series of sermons by Moses, final instructions for the people of God before they enter the land flowing with milk and honey. Moses is telling them how to live in this new land. And what we've read this morning is his concluding message, his final sermon to the people of Israel. It contains instructions for worship, specifically in regards to tithes and offerings in the community. This passage is rather long, and it reads kind of clunky. There's a lot of repetition, and the sentence structure isn't all that great if we read it in English. But we have to remember that this was written in another language, and it was written long before the invention of the printing press. And so when this was read before the community of people, it's not like they had pew Bibles open before them and they could read along with those who were reading out loud. The repetition is there to help this story get into the marrow of the people, to know it by heart. When you enter the land, Moses tells the Israelites, the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. The land that they're going into, it's not theirs, but it belongs to God. God is giving it to them as a gift, and it's ultimately God's. God is the one who gives it. You know, this strikes me as contrary to everything we believe as Americans. We tend to think of ourselves as self-made, that everything we have is because of our own hard work and effort, and at the end of the day, what we have ultimately belongs to us. And so when we give, when we donate, when we tithe, there is this sense that it's a sacrifice, a giving up of something that is ultimately ours. But not so for the Israelites. What they have is not their own, but it belongs to God. God asks the Hebrews to put some, not a specific amount, not a percentage, just some of the first fruits that they have and give them back to God. Not the leftovers, but the first of everything they harvest. It belongs to God anyways. Now I'm going to admit I'm not entirely comfortable with this idea, and some of you might feel the same way. It's hard for me to imagine when the paycheck comes in, the first bill I write is my tithe to the church. I mean, I have a mortgage and I have student loans. I have things to pay for outside of the church. The thought gives me a little bit of anxiety. But it's one that we hear here in Deuteronomy, a reminder that the land that they live on is not their own, but it belongs to God and it's to be used for God's purposes. When individuals and families bring their offering before the Levites, the priestly class, they are to make a confession of faith. But this is no mere obedient exercise. They are not reading words that were written down on a page. No, this is a confession of faith that recounts the events of the Exodus. It's one that would have been told to them by their parents and grandparents, one that they would have known by heart. The story of how God liberates slaves and descends to the downtrodden and the oppressed. A story they could have recited from memory, that with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a display of power, God rescued them and redeemed them. God brought them to the very land from which they will take that offering and offer as a gift. And so now, in response, those who bring that tithe say, "So now I bring the first fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me." Giving, tithing in the imagination of Deuteronomy all flows out of response and gratitude to God. There's a deep understanding that what they possess is not their own, that what God has asked for them isn't everything, isn't all that they have, because this is not the God of Egypt who takes and takes and takes until there is nothing left. This is the God of Israel who is concerned with the well-being of God's people. Just some of what they have is to be given for God's purposes. Because when the offering is received, when the people together with the Levites and the immigrants living in God's good and bountiful land, they will celebrate together with what has been offered. The receiving of the offering is a party. It's a great feast. Everyone gets to eat together, celebrating what God has done and what God continues to do. What's so amazing about this is that the Levites and the immigrants get to eat because of this offering. The Levites, the priestly class, had no land and therefore they had nothing to offer. The immigrants who were there, who lived on the land immigrants were there, refugees from wars, those searching for a better life for themselves and their families. Some of them had arrived among the Israelites and would remain there the rest of their lives. And others of them may have just been passing through. But they also had no land and they also had nothing to offer. But they also get to eat, and they also get to have life in Israel because of the offering. Further down in this instruction about tithing is widows and orphans. When they offer back to God some of what they have received from the divine hand, it's used to help these vulnerable people. And there is a celebration and there is a party with what has been offered. The offering is not simply a duty and an obligation, but it is used for a higher purpose, to create community. You know, this instruction and all the instructions in Deuteronomy are presented as being given by Moses before the people entered the land. This is something that hasn't happened yet. It's a future possibility. It sets before the people a vision of what's possible. And specifically here in this section, how the offering can create a community that reflects God's vision and God's mission for the world. Whether or not the Israelites will put this into action remains to be seen. You know, I've been here for over a year now. The anniversary of my ordination was just a couple of weeks ago, and it kind of passed by unceremoniously. I kind of thought that when the 1-year anniversary of my ordination arrived, I would have some sort of celebration for myself. But it sort of passed by. I didn't really notice or remember that it was that day until the sun was setting. But what's been on my mind lately is the vision and mission of this congregation. What is the vision for our life together? What is the mission we are seeking to accomplish? What does the future hold for First Presbyterian Church? This has been on my mind, it's been in my heart, and it's been in my prayers in recent weeks. And it was affirmed to me at our congregational meeting last week that it is time for us as a community to start to think about our vision and our mission. I don't like to make one-to-one comparisons, especially when it comes to the Israelites and the Promised Land. I think there's been a lot of damage that's been done by thinking of ourselves as being in the place of the Israelites and entering the Promised Land. I don't think that we're looking towards the Promised Land, but I do think, like the Israelites, we are looking into our future, the future of what's possible for this church. And so beginning next year, we're going to start doing some visioning for this church to give ourselves a clear sense of who we are and what we want to accomplish. I'm not exactly sure what that process is going to look like just yet, but I have begun to look. This week I have a phone call with our general presbyter to discuss how this process might look. So there are steps being made to get this process effort going. When it comes to the church budget and our finances, the question I'm most interested in is how can we give to help accomplish that mission? Our church budget should be more than just about meeting the financial needs and responsibilities of this church. Yes, I want to be paid. Yes, our staff should be paid. Yes, the lights need to stay on. But what is the broader and bigger mission and vision of this congregation? Today is Commitment Sunday. It's the day when we fill out our pledge cards and we indicate how much we're willing to donate to the church in 2019. And I understand that over the course between now and when 2019 happens, that there are events in our lives that require some of our finances. And I understand that might make it difficult to fill out a pledge card knowing that you have that responsibility, that promise that you've made. And so I understand if you don't fill out a pledge card today. But even if you don't, I ask that you think about how your tithes and your offerings can contribute to the vision and mission of this congregation, to what you want to see this church become. Look at what the Israelites had the potential to create with their offerings. They had the possibility to create a community where everyone had equality before God. The Levites, widows, orphans, and immigrants among them had enough to eat, and they all got to join in life with one another. As we look into our future, what sort of community are we trying to create? What sort of possibilities lie on our horizon? What can we create with what we offer in service to God? I find great hope and inspiration in thinking about what that could look like. And my sincerest desire is that it fills all of us with hope and it energizes us as we dream and vision together. Amen. I invite you to rise as you are able, as we will sing hymn 712, As Those of Old Their First Fruits Brought.